Good afternoon. I'm glad to see so much conversation over lunch, but we'd like to return to the program. My name is Laura Gitman, and I lead BSR's global membership strategy, as well as our office here in New York. And for that reason, I'm especially thrilled to be able to introduce our next I3 speaker. If you have not yet been to the High Line, I highly recommend a visit next time you're in New York. It's what I would call an oasis on the west side of Manhattan. It's an abandoned, elevated railroad designed into 1.5 miles of elevated park. Since opening just 5 years ago, the High Line is already one of New York's most popular destinations, and what's interesting is that it's for both tourists and locals alike. It welcomes nearly 5 million visitors a year, and is estimated to create $500 million in tax revenue for New York City. As we think about global trends in urbanization, the High Line has become an important symbol of community revitalization and urban sustainability. What I think is truly remarkable about the story of the High Line is that it exemplifies this week's conference theme of transformation. Robert Hammond, who is the executive director and co-founder of Friends of the High Line, is not an expert in urban design. He's an artist and an entrepreneur. And yet he saw a rundown, abandoned, elevated railroad and was able to transform it into an amazing park that is truly a part of the city. And in the process, transformed the entire neighborhood as well as global expectations for the relationships we have come to desire between our parks and cities. I've been thinking a lot this week about the theme of transformation and about the story of the High Line. And I think there are 3 key elements that are critical for such a radical transformation. And I think you'll hear about these as Robert joins me on the stage in just a moment. The first is vision. The vision to see possibility for the future when others see despair or simply can't see past the status quo. The second is collaboration. Robert could not have achieved that vision on his own. He had to bring together a huge collaboration of experts, of designers and architects, policymakers, photographers, funders, economists, and community leaders. And he also had to figure out how to get them all to work together towards that common vision. And that brings me to the last key element, perseverance. If you had seen the abandoned railroad before this project began, or if you know anything about New York City politics, this was no easy feat. Robert and the Friends of the High Line organization needed to have incredible dedication and perseverance to see through the complexities of zoning laws, feasibility studies, fundraising, policy development, and the construction project itself in order to bring that vision to a reality. Now we experience this beautiful space and we can't imagine it any other way. So I urge you to think about these elements as you listen to Robert this afternoon, but think about them as well as you embark on helping your companies solve some of today's complex sustainability challenges. We need a lot more vision, collaboration, and perseverance if we're going to achieve a more sustainable future. Please join me in welcoming Robert Hammond to the stage.
Thanks for having me today. And what I thought I'd do is talk a little bit about the history of the High Line, because that's so wrapped up in what this project has become. Talk a little bit about how we turned this abandoned railroad into a park, and then some of the challenges we're facing now. So, let's see. Oh, great, got it, great. So the High Line, how many people have been to the High Line? Oh, that's so nice. And it's not going anywhere, so if you haven't made it, you can do it on the next trip too. So just to orient you, it's a 1.5 mile old elevated rail line on the west side of Manhattan. But this is what it originally looked like. The trains ran down on 10th Avenue, and it was called Death Avenue because so many people were run over by the trains, that the railroad hired a guy on horseback to ride in front of the trains to move people out of the way, and he became nicknamed the West Side Cowboy. But he wasn't that successful because people were killed about once a month, that they elevated it. And this was always a freight train that running right through the middle of the West Side, which was the manufacturing district of New York. But with the rise of interstate trucking, it was used less and less. And the last train rode on the High Line in 1980. It was a train of frozen turkeys. And then it was abandoned. And this is basically what I saw. I lived in the West Village and moved to New York in the early 90s. And I just saw this abandoned, I just sort of thought of it as like our version of the Roman aqueducts, this sort of industrial relic. And then I read an article in 1999 that it was going to be demolished. And I assumed, I don't know if what your cities are like, but in New York, everything has a preservation group attached to it. So I thought, oh, there must be someone trying to save this thing, and I could help out. And, but no one was doing anything. But I heard it was on the agenda of a community board meeting, which I'd never been to a community board meeting. I'd never really wanted to go to one. And now that I've been to hundreds, I don't know if I don't know how I feel about them. But they're wonderful and awful, I guess. But I went to my first community board meeting and sat next to another guy, and we didn't know each other. And by the end of the meeting, we realized we were the only two people that liked the High Line. Most people either didn't care or actually really wanted to tear it down. So we exchanged business cards, as you sometimes do, or you did when people had business cards. And I said, well, I'm really busy. Why don't you do something? And he said, I'm busier. You do it. And we said, well, maybe we'll do it together. And so that's how we started this project. And I think most people, and so then people think we always snuck up there, but it wasn't quite that romantic. We just asked the railroad if we could go up there. And CSX gave us a tour, and this is what we found, which was basically 1.5 miles of wildflowers running right through the middle of the city. And that's when I really fell in love with this project, because it was this juxtaposition of sort of hard and soft, this man-made structure overtaken by nature. And that's when we got really excited about doing something. But Josh and I had no experience in this. I'm not an architect. I'm not a planner. He's a travel writer. My background was I was a painter, and basically what we called in the late 90s the dot-com guys. I was working on little internet startups. And so we really didn't have any plan, no money, and definitely no relevant experience. And in some ways, that was the key to the success of the project. One of the things I did do is I was a good marketer, and so I didn't know what else to do, so I was like, oh, let's get a logo. And so we got Paula Scher at Pentagram, one of the best. Actually, I won't go into the story of why she did it for free, but and early on, one of the biggest criticisms of label, when people thought the project was crazy, someone said, oh, this project is nothing, it's just two guys and a logo. And I think the logo maybe deserves more credit than the two guys. But it was to show that we had something going on, because we were just doing this out of our apartments. But also it was a commitment that good design was going to follow this all the way through. That we thought this was such a long shot that if we were successful, we weren't just going to throw a planter and a bench up there and call it a day. That good design was going to be part of this project at every step. So we belabored over fonts for benefit invites and websites and things like that. And interestingly, Paula's logo that she designed for these two guys is now the logo for the whole park. The other thing is, we didn't go right into design. So many times when people start projects, when they would out, my friends would be like, oh, so you want to do this? Why? What would you do? And instead of going into design right away, because then you start narrowing it, and people are like, oh, I don't like that design, or I want this. We focused on what it was at the time, and we got this photographer, Joel Sternfeld, to go up there and photograph it throughout the different seasons. And this picture is really what we sold. And I learned to talk less and show these photos more, because it allowed different people would see different things. Some people would see a site for a park. Some people say, oh, a site for rail use. Some people saw industrial preservation. Some people saw horticulture. Some people saw a place for art. Some people saw a place for urban planning. And it enabled us to really get a large group of people behind us. And then interestingly, the design came out of this, because it turns out, well, that's what people wanted, something inspired by what was actually there. But at the time, we didn't have, most people, even in the neighborhood, didn't like it. The mayor at the time, Mayor Giuliani, hated it. He wanted to tear it down. He signed a demolition order 2 days before he left office. But one of the things that we quickly learned is sometimes your opponents can be your best advocates. So if people didn't really care about the pretty Joel Sternfeld pictures, I'd say, well, Giuliani hates it. And they were like, oh, it must be a great idea. Happy to get out my checkbook. Happy to write that check. And then when Bloomberg came in office, he was much more open to it. But 9/11 had happened, and honestly, we didn't just need someone that was supportive. We needed someone that was really going to get behind it. So we commissioned a firm called HR&A to do an economic feasibility study to show that it made economic sense. And we wanted to show that over a 20-year time period, the tax revenues to the city would be greater than the costs, even though the city wasn't going to pay for it all. So Central Park's the best example of creating value, but no one was going to think the High Line could be anything like that. So we looked at these tiny pocket parks around Manhattan that you've probably never heard of. But the real estate value within 2 blocks of this is anywhere between 5 to 15% greater. We also look what really creates value is if you create a district, a neighborhood that people want to visit, live, work in, shop in. So we started thinking of the High Line as sort of a High Line district. This is a map actually Paula Schur did of all the businesses in the neighborhood. Because at the time, the side of Manhattan, there wasn't as much going on, so it was hard to imagine how, but we said the High Line would help knit all these things together. So as you do when you do a feasibility study, you put a number that's pretty high out there, it's not really that real, but it's a feasibility study, so everyone's going to discount it. And so we said that it would create about $250 million in added tax revenues to the city and cost about $100 million. We got both of those numbers wrong. It turns out it cost about $150 million. When it's all done, it'll be about $200 million. But when we redid the study in 2012, it showed that it would bring about almost $1 billion to the tax revenues of the city over the course of 20 years. So, the Bloomberg administration got behind it. We had a lot of other political support, Chuck Schumer, Hillary Clinton. And so, you can only fight City Hall so long. This has really been an example of a great public-private partnership. And I love this photo because notice how none of them are looking at each other? It's something you learn as a politician. You can stand with a whole bunch of other politicians and not have to acknowledge any of them. But even with the Bloomberg administration on board, we were still being sued by the property owners. One property owner spent $3 million in legal fees fighting us. So we knew we needed to get them on board. So we looked at Grand Central is a great preservation case right next door. But most people don't know the way it was really preserved was not just Jackie O's preservation campaign and landmark law, but it was also a transfer of development rights that allowed the owner, the railroad, to transfer the development rights around, and actually the development rights in this hotel were built from there. So that was the same mechanism we used for the High Line, is allowing those underlying property owners to transfer their development rights anywhere in the neighborhood. So that's what helped get them on board. We did a rezoning of the neighborhood that also kept the mid-blocks manufacturing to preserve the art galleries. But even with the zoning, we still didn't have any money. We were a long way from being able to get this done. So we did an ideas competition. And the other thing is no one knew what the High Line was. Even in the neighborhood, the way I would describe it, it's that dark thing you walk under and you're worried about pigeons droppings on it. And they're like, oh, that thing, I hate that thing. And so we did this ideas competition, and we got entries from 720 entries around the world. This is my favorite, which is the mile-long lap pool, and I think I just like it for many reasons. But that's the running through the city, and this is what really helped capture the attention of people. And it got people thinking about it. This was a political manifesto of a park, prison, pool. This is, I think, taking on High and High Line. And this was not talking about design, but the programming that would happen on the High Line. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, how important that is. And my other favorite was the mile-long urban roller coaster. But we knew none of these things were going to happen. And we always said that one of the advantages of not being architects, we said we weren't going to design it. And we always said the city, the neighborhood, should decide what happened. So we sent out, after we finished the design competition, we got more support from the city. We got our first funding. And so we started doing community input about what did people want. And this is a postcard that we sent out, asking people for their input. And over the course of the past probably 10 years, we've done over 25 different community input sessions about what people actually want. So before we even did the real design competition, before we did the design brief, we heard from the community of what they wanted. And this is one of my favorite comment cards, is the High Line should be preserved untouched as a wilderness area. No doubt you will ruin it, so it goes. And this was above my desk. I mean, still, I left the High Line. I ran the High Line for 15 years, and then I stepped down in December. And then, as the best laid plans don't always work out, the person that was brought in to replace me didn't work, and so I'm now back at the High Line. But I think I lost that card. But this was my biggest fear as well: is how do you preserve this wilderness, this sort of this magical experience, but you had to remove everything that was there to remediate it, to get rid of the lead paint, to put in drainage. And so this is where the design team of James Corner Field Operations, Diller Scofidio and Renfro, and Pete Oldoff came up with something great. And at the time, I was reading the book The Leopard, and there's a great quote in that book that says, for everything to stay the same, everything has to change. And I'm getting it a little bit wrong. And that's what I felt like they did, is they realized they captured the spirit of the High Line, but they knew they couldn't keep it as is. And so they developed this planking system that could be used in different ways. And this is actually the competition M-Tree. And this is it being built. And it's just, the High Line was actually very expensive to build, but it's not the actual design you see. Most of it is in the remediation, the lead paint remediation. The design is actually a set of concrete pieces. There's about 9 of them that are used in different ways. They're precast concrete. It's like a fancy parking curb. But the experience that you have up there is very special, just using these simple materials and the planting palette. And here it is, sort of an aerial view. The other thing that makes the High Line work is the planting by Pete Oldoff. And it's inspired by what was there, but I asked him one day, I said, can I call this a natural landscape? And he said, there's actually nothing natural about it. It's idealized nature. And I have to tell you, it's very expensive to have idealized nature. And one of the things I love about Pete is he's famous for not just picking beautiful flowers, but they're all perennials. We never remove anything that's up there. It all just comes out year after year. We're not planting tulips. But it's also for what it looks like this time of year and later. One of my favorite quotes from Pete's is he says, brown is a color too in gardens. And so we leave all of the dead plants throughout the year until the spring. And then there's lots of special features. I'm going to just go through these really quickly. I hope I'll get a chance to go up there. That's the sunken overlook over 10th Avenue, and where it's really just sort of exposing the city. The High Line, the great park in New York, Central Park, is an escape from the city. The High Line's not meant to be an escape. The High Line is part of the city. It's a different way of seeing the city. It's not meant to feel like you're in, the countryside. This is at 30th Street. The High Line used to be covered in billboards, so this is sort of a take on that. Instead of framing advertisements, it frames from one side the people and from the other side the city around you. This is the water feature. One of the things the community, when we opened the first section of the High Line, one of the complaints was it didn't have a lawn. So we built a lawn on in section 2 at 30th Street. This is a flyover that goes through a grove of trees. And then the last section just opened about a month ago at the rail yards, and where we have a rail yards walk. And one of my favorite parts is we were able to leave. This is the play feature. That's the other thing the community wanted, is something for kids. We didn't want to just put a swing set up there. So the design team came up with that idea: is you expose it and you put a rubberized surface on the beams underneath the High Line, and that becomes the play feature. But my favorite part is we were able to finally leave because we actually didn't have money to finish the High Line. We just put this temporary walkway in, and we left what I first discovered 15 years ago. Now you can go and see it, what it looked like the first day I went up there. We can't leave it permanently because it's not remediated, but it'll last for a good 10 or 15 years like that. Now, in the High Line, I talked about that, the economic value to the city, and it's become, for better or for worse, a big economic generator. And there's two sides to it. Some people, love the neighborhood the way it was. The High Line neighborhood was going to change with or without the High Line. I think the High Line has sped that development up. This is a map of just a few of the developments that are happening in and around the neighborhood. One of the good things is it's encouraged a lot of developers to use great architects. There's a spot you can stand here and see a building by Frank Gehry, Jean Nouvel, Shigeru Ban, Isabel Seldorf. Zaha Hadid is just going in the ground with a new building. The new Whitney Museum of Art is now going to be at the base of the High Line. That's going to open up next year. And I talked about the tax revenues also. It's just in terms of what's happening in the neighborhood and the construction that's already been happening. We originally thought we'd have about 300,000 visitors a year. That's what a medium size, that's what the Guggenheim, the Whitney sees right now, about 300. Last year we had 4.5 million. This year we're on track to have almost 6 million visitors. So to put that in perspective, that's double what MoMA gets in a very small space, which is great for tourism. It's great for a lot of the businesses in the neighborhood, but it's also a problem. It also gets crowded. It's also, how do we continue this? We built this for New Yorkers. We love visitors coming, but it's meant for New Yorkers. And so one of the ways we do that is programming. We do about 450 free programs throughout the year, and all of it is geared towards locals. Tourists are welcome to come. Y'all are welcome to be part of it. You can look on our website and see what we're doing this week. But we gear it on what locals and tourists want. We do salsa dancing every month throughout the summer. We do, this was just 2 weeks ago, we did a big communal meal up on the High Line where we served almost 1,000 people soup. We do a lot of kids program. That's one of the things the locals wanted, is things for their kids. We do a variety of different education programs throughout the year. The High Line runs, most people think of it's all a very wealthy neighborhood, but there's two large public housing projects in the neighborhood. And one of the things we found is when the High Line opened, they were not coming to the High Line. And so we surveyed 20% of the people that lived there to find out what was happening. It turns out they weren't going to Hudson River Park either. That was another 2 blocks away from them. And they felt like it wasn't for them. They said, we didn't see people that looked like us there. And so one of the things we did is we asked them, what do they want? And one of the things they really wanted was jobs. And so we created a teen outreach program that actually designs our own programming. So it's giving them jobs, but then they're creating the programming for the neighborhood. And they also said, we don't like the programming you're doing. And so they now basically create the program for the neighborhood. It's been a very successful program that other parks are now following. The other thing we do programming-wise is on art. The High Line runs right through the heart of the gallery district, but galleries really don't want you to come visit. They want really rich people to come visit. And you can always tell when they're not that friendly to you. And so we wanted to bring the contemporary art in the neighborhood to the public, free and welcoming. So we have a public art program that it changes. Nothing's permanent. It's always changing. We do about 30 different projects throughout the year. Tonight we have an opening of one of our new photography projects. This is one of the most popular. One of the problems of doing temporary art is people get really upset when it goes away. This was sort of a stylized bird feeder by Sarah Z. We do art on some of the billboards in and around the High Line. This is by Gilbert George. We do video projections throughout the year on 2 spaces at 14th and 22nd. This is a Carol Beauvais sculpture from last year. This is El Natsui. He's a Nigerian-born artist who did this sculpture on the side of one of the blank walls next to the High Line. And I wanted to come back to and end with this point about Central Park because, again, a great example of a park being an economic generator and a resource for the city, but it was also an example for us of how it's managed. Most people probably don't know Central Park is privately managed. It's a public park, but the Central Park Conservancy raises over 80% of the funds to support the park. And that's the same, it's even more so with the High Line, is that 100% of the funds of our roughly, depending on how you cut it, $6 to $9 million budget, we only get $30,000 from the city. The remainder of that is all privately raised. So every employee you see up on the High Line is a Friends of the High Line employee. And it's interesting, the other thing about the visitation, every visitor makes it more expensive for us to operate. And so that's a constant challenge for us, is raising that money. And if anybody wants to become a member, you can become a member. Friends, thehighline.org starts at $40. You'll get a letter from me saying thank you. And this is, we have about now, this is a little old, about 90 staff that manage and operate and run all of our programs. So that's one of the ongoing challenges that we face, is we're not benefiting from all of the economic development we're changing. It's one of the biggest mistakes we made. And when I talk to other groups that are starting these kind of projects, it's one of the things I urge and try to work with them on, is how you can create a model where you capture some of that value that you're creating. And one of the great, I always had three my goals for the Highline was it becomes a well-loved park, that it inspires others. And that's one of the great things. It's inspired a lot of other people to start their own kind of projects. This is one right here in Manhattan called the Low Line, and where they've taken an old underground trolley terminal. And it's really what I like. A lot of people say, oh, we want to build High Lines. And it's not that really interesting when someone wants to just do another High Line. What I find interesting is when people are doing things that actually reflect their own neighborhood. And so this is really a technology play in some ways. It's taking a technology, fiber optics, to take light and light this underground space. And that's what I find so many of these projects, they're not trying to be the High Line. They're not trying to do our design. They're taking something from their own city, from their own neighborhood, from their own structure that's relevant, and making that part of the design. They realize it doesn't have to be as expensive as the High Line. And so that's what I find really exciting about it, is that, and to me what I hope the example is, you don't have to be an expert. Although you do have to raise a lot of money, you don't have to have the money in the beginning. And you don't really have to know exactly what you're doing when you start out. And I think going back to that slide about no money, no relevant experience, no plan, and one of the reasons I think it was a key to our success is that it made us turn to other people to get all of this done. And create sort of a community around the project. And so I hope you all get a chance to visit, and thank you all for having me.